Welcome to our second webinar for Time4Action. As you know, my name's Ken Johnson, and my colleagues Rolly Montpellier and Kathleen O'Hara, all three of us are on Algonquin Anishinaabe unceded territory, and these people have lived here for centuries and are continuing to fight to protect their environment. Speaking of fighters, I'd like to introduce our guests. First of all, Alexandra Woodsworth from Dogwood in BC. Dogwood's a great grassroots group that's British Columbia focused, and maybe you could say a couple of words about that a little later, Alexandra. And she grew up in BC. She went off in the mid-2000s to London, England to do her PhD in social movement studies, but she's luckily back. She came back a few years ago, but when she was there, as she mentioned, she was involved in stopping airport expansion and coal expansion and other things. She returned to BC in 2012, where she worked for the Georgia Strait Alliance and now for Dogwood. Our other panelist today is Sven. He's the Oil and Gas Program Director with Stand.Earth. Before joining the organization in 2013, he worked as a campaign director at the Tanker Free BC and as the Wilderness Committee's Director of Outreach. And I think that Tanker Free BC, Sven, was that the one where you had oil spills on toonies?
That was actually Dogwood.
Sorry? That was what?
That was the Dogwood, Dogwood
okay. BC. Okay, I stand corrected. Now he's playing a key role in Stand.Earth's work to build community opposition to the Trans Mountain Pipeline and tanker proposal, and to work towards addressing the climate crisis. Apparently he likes Mexican food and craft beer, but maybe that'll be a little later. So. Now I'll turn things over to Kathleen. She's going to interview Alexandra and Sven for about 25 or 30 minutes, and then I'll ask a few questions, and then put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll pick up on some of the ones from the audience. Okay, Kathleen.
All right, thanks, Ken. And thank you both for joining us, Alexandra and Sven. I'd like to start with an overview of the tar sands right now. We keep hearing about investors pulling out, workers being fired. What's the future for them? I mean, they are the root of all evil in terms of pipelines. So let's start with an overview there. Alexandra, could you start?
Sure. And yeah, you mentioned my UK background. It was, as I was living abroad, I know I saw the kind of massive conversation in Canada of the tar sands and the oil sands starting to rise up as this fundamental question of, what kind of development, what kind of resource development we want to see in this country. And the environmental impacts of that type of project, of the scars on the land, of the local impacts on health, on communities, on the environment. That was kind of how I came first to this fight, was around that kind of, this is the most dirty form of oil we can possibly have in this world. And so that's kind of how I started to see this international attention starting to shine on this kind of Canada's shame. This is not how we want to be developing. This is not the kind of resource we want to see. And fast forward to now, and I think what we're seeing is, a global and a recognition among so many people in Canada that, the time for this type of industry, particularly this heavy oil, this super polluting, super carbon intensive type of product, is over. And I think that's what we've seen, obviously over the last 5-6 years, we've seen, prices just continuing to go down, down, down. And obviously then we had coronavirus, global oil price shocks, including to, Western Canadian Select, the kind of benchmark price for tar sands oil. And what it's doing is it's hastened a decline. It's hastened a kind of price issue that was already coming. As globally we start to transition away from oil, we recognize the impacts of climate, and global governments come together to start taking climate action. The kind of price shocks that we've seen have hastened a transition that was already coming, is what I would say. So we have all these oil majors around the world saying, declaring that the phase of growth of oil and oil prices is over. We have global energy agencies saying this shift is happening. And we have major investors pulling out of the tar sands as a result. So that's kind of how we see it, that this era is rapidly coming to a close. And this is a conversation for Canada about whether we want to double down on a dinosaur industry with our tax dollars, using our money to prop up a dying industry, or whether we want to use those dollars right now and put them into the transition that we know is already here. And that obviously Joe Biden has just given us really clear signals that he's going to be going all in on. And I know that's part of the reason why we're here today, is kind of talk about some of the impacts of Biden's decisions.
Sven, anything you want to say about the poor old tar sands?
Sure. I mean, I guess I would just add that Alexandra raised a lot of the ethical and environmental concerns around the oil sands. But that this is a bad economic bet. And it's not just because oil in general is in decline. The tar sands are kind of at the bleeding edge of that decline. They are more expensive to extract than conventional oil, more expensive to refine, more expensive to transport. And when you add to that the fact that tar sands or oil sands has higher concentrations of sulfur and other impurities, it means it's just a less valuable product. That's why Western Canadian Select doesn't get the price that other oil does in the world market. It's a lower value product. So Canada is going to get squeezed out of this market, whether Jason Kenney or Justin Trudeau throw a temper tantrum or not. And I think that if we were thinking about our economic future as well as our environmental future, we would be planning for this transition now and make sure that Canadian workers and Canadian companies are fighting for the new jobs in a more sustainable economy, instead of trying to hold on to dear life to this industry that we now can clearly see has peaked and is starting to ramp down.
And yet, as we all know, the day after declaring a climate emergency, Trudeau bought us, with our money, the Trans Mountain expansion pipeline. Can you tell us about that? Where do things stand with it? First physically, and then we'll talk financially.
Sure.
Sven?
Yeah, I can start on this one. So I guess the Trans Mountain pipeline, we have seen, I guess the most recent news around this comes from the Canadian Energy Regulator and the Parliamentary Budget Officer. The Canadian Energy Regulator, its successor at the National Energy Board, the NEB and the CER, they're friends of the oil industry. They're what we call captured regulators that side with the oil companies more than with the people. So the CER in the most recent they do an annual report on the state of Canadian energy. They said that in a world where we take action on climate change, and by that they mean any action. They don't mean that we hit our climate targets or that we keep temperatures below 2 or even 1.5 degrees. We do anything more than we're currently doing, we don't need the Trans Mountain pipeline. Demand won't be high enough for projects like Keystone and Trans Mountain to have customers. And then the Parliamentary Budget Office, who has been doing a series looking into the viability of the pipeline since it's purchased by the public, put out a report late last year that shows that in around 90% of the scenarios that they ran, the pipeline is a money loser for the Canadian taxpayer. So we are in kind of a weird scenario where the pipeline is going ahead. Construction is still happening slowly here on the ground in Western Canada. And the Canadian government continues to pour billions of dollars of taxpayers' money into this project. But more and more, it looks like the business case for this pipeline no longer exists.
Alexandra, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of what is happening there, there has been construction out here in BC, and there has been opposition, as we have known all along, that people in BC are they're deeply opposed, and communities along the route are deeply opposed, and Indigenous communities have said no, and so we have seen resistance as we have seen construction. The lion's share of the construction has happened in the Edmonton area, and then there has also been quite a bit of right-of-way clearing up along the route in northeastern BC. Less so in the Lower Mainland, although it is starting to arrive. But the numbers, I think, are still really low. So the amount of money that has been spent and the amount of pipe in the ground is still fractional by comparison to how much money could be saved. So there is absolutely still time for Trudeau to see the messages from his own agencies, his own regulator, his own watchdogs, that this is a losing bet for Canadians. I think, that's a really important point to make, because there is a lot of sense, particularly I think in the national media, that this is a done deal. This thing is happening. There's no turning the ship around, but that is simply not the case. And I think that's another lesson we can take from, Keystone, right at the other end of things, permits in hand, this thing's getting built and the decision can still be reversed. So that's certainly something I draw strength and inspiration from, is that, when we're in these fights and things are seeming bleak, we know that decisions can always be made differently. So just wanted to really highlight the fact that, dollars spent, pipe in the ground, plenty of time to turn things around. And yeah, I can talk a little bit more about like opposition on the ground at a different moment if that's where we want to go. But, we've had amazing community members out in Burnaby who have been up in trees that are in the path of construction for the last, since August almost. So I know it's people kind of look to BC to see this kind of flashpoint and this kind of resistance. And I think community members and Indigenous leaders are right there. And we're going to see more of that if pipeline construction continues to ramp up through the summer, as Trans Mountain says they're planning to do.
Well, that's wonderful news. And speaking of opposition, let's move on to the Coastal GasLink. There's been a lot of opposition to that. Can you start us off, Sven? Where does that stand?
So the Coastal GasLink pipeline, for folks that don't know, it's a pipeline just in BC. It connects gas fields near Fort St. John's in the northeast of BC to a giant LNG facility on Canada's west coast in Kitimat called Canada LNG. If it goes forward, Canada LNG would be one of the largest sources of climate emissions anywhere in the country. The only things larger would be a couple of tar sands mines. So it's a huge project with a huge environmental footprint. It has been opposed on the ground by the Wet'suwet'en leadership, the traditional leadership of that nation, whose roles and rights have been acknowledged by the Supreme Court. And that pipeline, it's kind of in a somewhat similar state to Trans Mountain. There is some construction happening on the ground. There is still conversations with Wet'suwet'en elders going on. And I've heard rumors that they're not going particularly well, and there is a potential of another flashpoint there this winter. So we're going to continue to watch that closely and continue to work with Wet'suwet'en leadership to try to lift up their voices and make sure that Canadians really understand both the risk to their traditional way of life and to our climate in our country from this project.
Alexandra, this is fracked gas, right? And so even though we're all told that natural gas is a great transitional fuel, what do you think about that? I mean, it doesn't sound very CO2 friendly.
Absolutely, and I think that's a classic example of industry doing some excellent PR. And the BC government in past eras, in particular, really went all in on that. Really put LNG forward as this clean brand. And we absolutely know that's not true. Particularly more recently, studies have shown that it's can be, when you include all the types of emissions from cradle to grave, oil well to combustion. We're looking at levels on a level of coal burning. So this is not a transition fuel. It's just an absolute myth that the industry's been peddling far too successfully for far too long. Let alone, the earthquakes, the scars on the land at the point of extraction, and the health impacts that there have been just, tragic stories of the kinds of health impacts for communities on the ground. So it's a very similar story, right? These frontline, the word is escaping me, frontline communities and sacrifice zones, right, at the point of extraction, which is very similar story in Northeast BC, where these fracking wells originate, and on the ground in Fort Mac and other places in Northern Alberta where where the tar sands originate, which is another point that we often forget. We come into this kind of global climate conversation, but it's also so important to bring back the faces and the people who are dealing with this right now on the ground at the point of extraction and along construction routes.
And where does the NDP government stand on this? Is it absolutely behind it?
The provincial NDP currently is yes. I mean, they, in opposition, they were vocal. They talked about this being, a sellout for British Columbia in terms of the subsidies. So we have huge amounts of subsidies in British Columbia and federally as well for LNG Canada. But in terms of the kind of subsidy regime for fracked gas for LNG in BC, it's significant. The amount in BC that we're giving away on these kinds of things is doubles the amount we're spending on climate action. So that's pretty enraging as well. But yeah, so far the BC NDP is all in on getting these things, on getting these projects built, and that's something we need to reverse because it's a huge hole in BC's Clean BC Climate Plan. We know we can't meet our climate targets if we continue to develop fracked gas and we continue to develop Coastal GasLink and LNG Canada. There's no real way to reconcile the kind of emissions targets we're trying to hit with these huge carbon bound projects. So it's another fight here in BC with trying to get better decisions for climate action and really to force governments to grapple with the words they say on climate and their policy decisions doubling down on fossil fuels, because they absolutely cannot be reconciled.
No. Sven, I'd like to move on to the 3 US pipelines that we're hearing about, just so that people have a sense of the overall battle that we are fighting in northern North America. What about the Dakota Access Pipeline? We don't hear much about it now. Do you know where it stands at the moment?
So the Dakota Access Pipeline, it was completed and put into operation. However, recently courts have ruled that there were some legal errors in the approval process, and that it has been, there is some discussion about shutting that pipeline down, which would be a first. Usually once a pipeline is built and operational, it's kind of gone too far for us to stop it. This may be the first case where we've been able to stop a pipeline that's already being used.
Do you think Biden will make that move?
I think a combination of Biden in the courts, there's a lot of pressure on him around all 3 of these pipelines. I think he's more likely to move on line 3, which is one of the other pipelines I think we're going to talk about. But there is growing pressure on him to deal with a whole bunch of these projects that I think it's important to point out. So both U.S. oil and gas and cross-boundary Canadian oil and gas.
Well, then let's look at line 3, because there's a lot of activist movement there and dedication. Can you just tell us about line 3, Sven?
Sure. So line 3
it's an Enbridge pipeline.
That's right.
Right. Yeah.
So what they call the line 3 replacement, it is originally line 3 was built in the 1950s, just a couple years before the Trans Mountain Pipeline was built to the West Coast. They are calling this a replacement, but basically they are building a pipe that's 3 times as large and takes an entirely new route through Minnesota and Wisconsin. So kind of similar to the Trans Mountain story, where they call this a replacement or an upgrade, this is a new pipeline. This is about getting more tar sands or oil sands into the Enbridge's North American network. And it is facing a lot of on-the-ground opposition, especially from Indigenous folks in Minnesota. Wynonna LeDuc, who's really an inspirational leader, has been at the front of that fight. And so many people have stood up against it. It has been tied up in the courts and in state regulation in Minnesota for the last couple of years, maybe 5 years now. They've cleared a lot of the hurdles there, but they do need the same kind of presidential permit that stopped Keystone XL. So it's possible that that could be canceled. And there's a lot of focus on the new Biden administration in this project right now.
And another pipeline, there are too many, as we all know. This one, line 5, was mentioned in the House of Commons last week. And this is much more Canadian related. Can you tell us about that? Sven?
Sure. So line 5, it runs from where line 3 ends in Duluth, Wisconsin, through Michigan to Sarnia. And the controversial part is it runs under the strait that connects Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. And the governor of Michigan is, of course, very worried that this aging pipeline running very toxic product is has the potential to leak into the Great Lakes. So there has been some pressure around reissuing those permits that have come from the governor for this pipeline. They need to be reissued on a regular basis. And this has become very controversial in the state of Michigan. I think for Canadians, especially on the East Coast, line 5 connects to line 9. They're not very inventive in giving these pipelines name, which services refineries in Ontario and Quebec. So there is downstream impacts on Canadian consumers.
Well, it does seem a bit worrisome because now Sarnia is complaining or worried about job loss. So we won't, when we talk about green jobs, we're going to have to discuss jobs in refineries as well, I guess. I hadn't ever thought of that before. But anyone who's interested in the Line 5 controversy and the future of our Great Lakes, because it crosses from Lake Michigan to Lake Huron. Is that right, Sven?
It's right at the opening
Straits
of
of Mackinac.
Yes, that's right.
Anyway, go on Google because there's a video showing how bad, what bad shape this 60-year-old pipeline is in. And it looks like it's ready to go any minute. So I don't blame Governor Whitmer for calling a halt on it. And I think we should all be watching that as well. So I think we've covered quite a few pipelines, and it's just such a mess. Right now, I'd like to turn back to Alexandra because she has a few action points that she'd like to talk about.
Sure.
Alexandra?
I mean, really, I was just I'll pop a couple links in the chat just in a moment here. You know, it's tricky when we have such clear evidence. I think Sven kicked us off really well with an overview of the fact that the economic math doesn't add up. The climate math clearly doesn't add up. We've got, you know, opposition on the ground. We've got huge environmental impacts on the West Coast should there be a spill, and even in the absence of a spill. So, you know, why is Canada still in the pipeline business? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And, you know, it's a very different type of project and a different type of campaign when it's publicly owned. You know, we have, we kind of, as a campaign, we won when we forced Kinder Morgan to walk away because they saw the writing on the wall and they went, you know, they abandoned ship because they could see that this wasn't going to be a viable project. And for political reasons, our federal government stepped in and bailed them out. So I think that gives us both, like, you know, opportunities and challenges when it comes to trying to stop this project. On the one hand, government has very deep pockets. They can, you know, what they're doing, this is Canada's largest fossil fuel subsidy, Trans Mountain. And they can just keep printing money. That's literally what they're doing to make this project happen. So that prevents real challenges. But at the other side of things, this is a political game. If we change the political math, if we change, you know, we've got an election rumblings on the horizon, particularly, I would say, you know, in places in, you know, some of the battleground ridings in Ontario and Quebec, this is something that could be a real issue for Trudeau on a campaign trail when you know, he's trying to run on climate, and Trans Mountain is the poster child for the contradiction. So, you know, this is a political choice, and at the stroke of a pen, this project can be shut down if we build enough political pressure. So I've got 2 actions that folks can take. I'm sure Stand also has lots of opportunities there. We have one which is pointed at the Minister of Finance. She literally holds the pen here. She both, you know, she cuts the checks to fund this project, and you know, she's the one who can really make the call here. So Minister Freeland is a petition to cancel the project. And then we also have a kind of rapid response calling action just to really make sure that as Cabinet is feeling the pressure from industry in light of Biden's decision on Keystone to double down on Trans Mountain, that they hear these important points from the Canada Energy Regulator and from the Parliamentary Budget Officer saying that neither project is needed. You know, don't listen to that. Here are the facts from your own agencies. So take a look at those. And I will pop those in the chat now and see if Sven had any extra pieces to add there.
Sven, do you?
Yeah, I'll just add.
Are you reading the chats?
Just put something in the chat.
Sorry,
Oh.
I was trying to get off mute there. So I just added one more petition in the chat. This is to the insurers of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. We have
Great.
been working with a global coalition called Insure Our Futures to try to get some of the companies that insure this project to walk away from it. And we've had actually a lot of success. Last year, we got Zurich Insurance, the primary insurer of the project, to drop them as a client, along with two other German insurers. And more recently, we've heard from Lloyd's Insurance out of the UK that they are adopting a policy that would exclude this pipeline, as well as other high carbon fossil fuel projects. And we're going to be pushing this spring to get a couple of US insurers, Liberty Mutual and Chubb, to also drop the project. So look out for more information from Stand on how to do that this spring.
Well, it's wonderful that the funders are finally being named and shamed, because without money, nothing will flow, obviously. And last week, there was a National Day of Action calling on people to switch banks, kick out their fossil fuel banks. RBC, I don't know whether Rowley is around, is audible, but RBC has funded in huge number. It's the worst offender of all 5 chartered banks. So this is a wonderful initiative. I just wanted to ask, though, when you say, Alexandra, that Trudeau bought Trans Mountain for political reasons, that they don't seem to have panned out. Kenny is still, he still didn't get any Liberal MPs in the West. And what do you think where should he go from here? I mean, it's obviously a dead end. Any idea why he's sticking with this project?
I tell you, that's a question that we wrestle with all the time, because there is no good answer to it. You know, there's none that we can discern, apart from the fact that this project pipeline has become a symbol, right? It is, you know, it's a political symbol, and it's trying to be all things to all people. And that's not necessarily working out very well. There is an entrenched, you know, obviously, as you say, it didn't pan out in Alberta. They were shut out in the last election. It didn't provide the seats that perhaps they may have been hoping for, in that for the political math is not adding up either. You can add it to the list of reasons why this project isn't making sense. So obviously Trudeau's invested a lot of political capital, right? And it would look like a reversal of a decision. And we know politicians really don't like to do that. And that is honestly the answer that I have to arrive at, that it is about, you know, an inability to be seen to change course on a decision that has been in the works for a very long time, and really being very unwilling to look at the facts in hand and say, actually, because circumstances have changed. COVID really has changed the game, and we've seen so much new information come to light. And if there's an off-ramp there for them, they can say, you know, there are material differences in the economic circumstances that we weren't aware of when we bought this project. The trajectory looks different for us now. We're so aware of Canadians calling to build back better and to build back fossil free. We have political cover to make a different decision now. And really that is about enough of an opposition and enough of a loud chorus of voices from folks across Canada saying that that's the decision they'd like to see him make, and to give him the opportunity to make the right decision here.
Anything more on that, Sven?
I mean, I think it is at this point mostly about saving face. I would agree with Alexandra on that. I think initially this was you know, I think Trudeau is somewhat haunted by his father's legacy and the National Energy Program, and not wanting to fight Alberta. I think, you know, the problem there is that Jason Kenney would love nothing more than to start a constitutional fight with Ottawa. And we need to stop rewarding kind of bad actors like Jason Kenney by doing their bidding and expecting them to ever come to the table and act like reasonable politicians or human beings. I think we've seen plenty of that from our friends south of the border in recent times.
Well, the good news is that Jason's in hot water because he wants to destroy the mountains and dig for coal. And even people who voted for him are starting to rally against him. So I think we'll conclude this section on that excellent news. And I'll pass it over to Ken because he might have some questions that have come up. Thanks, both of you.
Thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, I do have a couple of follow-up questions for Alexandra and Sven. The first one, Alexandra, the economics of the Coastal Gas Link, I'm wondering if you could address those of them. We talked about subsidies briefly, but I'm just wondering what the analysis is on whether it's even economically viable. And Sven, you could pitch into it.
Yeah, I think there are strong parallels in the sense that the kind of gas bubble has burst, and BC was always late to the game. You know, BC was trying to join this, you know, get on the gas boom, so to speak, and was late to that. And, you know, from the analyses I've seen, Coastal GasLink and LNG Canada, which are you know, they are two projects, neither makes sense without the other. They don't add up without public money. So if the public money and the subsidies disappear, the economics of the projects collapse, which is why we're making Stan and Dogwood both have really focused on that public money angle, because it's, you know, as with across North America, these projects are collapsing and investors are pulling out, and the economics just aren't there. So I think we're seeing this across the board, which is that, you know, large scale fossil fuel new extraction and export projects are not viable without public money. And so I think we as taxpayers have real power there. We as citizens can say that we don't want this in our name, not with our tax dollars. This is where we do have power, and where governments have a great amount of influence if they pull those subsidies that just are so contradictory with their climate goals.
Ben?
I just would add to that, I guess, you know, we've seen some analysis that from IEFA, which is a great think tank that does research on energy and environment.
What's IEFA? What's IEFA?
Oh,
sorry,
you're going to make
put you on
me.
the spot. Sorry.
International.
International.
International Institute on Economics and the Environment, I believe.
Right.
But there's an F in there somewhere, so I'm missing something. So they've done some research. Basically, even with the subsidies, BC can produce LNG for about $8 a unit. Gulf states and Australia can undercut us by almost 50%. So even if we pay the companies $1 billion a year to produce this product, it's just not competitive on the world market. Thanks for putting the link in the chat.
And that's the billion is that's what they are currently. The NDP is currently subsidizing to the tune of $1 billion a year, I think.
That's right. The provincial government in BC gives about $1 billion to oil and gas producers. Most of that is going to fracking companies.
Fracking. Oh.
Yeah. 80% of the wells in British Columbia are fracking wells, and they get special credits like deep well credits, which is about $300,000 a year. And they're getting credits faster than they can use them up. So basically, they're paying British Columbians nothing to extract the gas and are building billions of dollars in liabilities up for the province.
I was wondering if about the royalties, if they completely essentially seemed to me, what I'd read is they essentially abandon the royalties because it makes it completely uneconomic.
Well, I mean, it's basically you know, oil and gas, like all natural resources, are supposed to belong to us, the people of Canada. And by reducing royalties, both in Alberta and the oil sands, in British Columbia and the gas fields, this is a kind of hidden subsidy, right? Basically, we're supposed to see value. We keep hearing from the oil and gas companies that their work pays for our roads and our hospitals. Well, the truth is that we're actually paying them to extract now and getting almost nothing back in revenue. BC makes substantially more taxing cigarettes than we do the oil and gas companies.
I wanted to turn to the Trans Mountain Pipeline. I know there's a fellow in Burnaby that I've gotten emails from. I think he's a retired professor at Simon Fraser, and he overlooks the Burnaby terminal. So he keeps track of what ships come into that end of the Trans Mountain and where they're headed. I guess there's a database you can figure out where they're headed. And what he finds is, even though the pitch from Trudeau and Notley and everyone is we have to get tar sands to tidewater, his analysis suggests that only maybe in the last 10 years, something like 10 or 12 tankers have actually gone to Asia. All the rest of them, not surprisingly, have just gone down the coast to California because that's where they get the best price. I wonder if you could, either or both of you could address that particular misnomer.
Yeah, I guess I can talk a little bit about that. You know, we have been also tracking tankers for years. The vast majority, and I think Greenpeace US has the best report on this, go to refineries in the Bay Area and Long Beach in California. California, you know, there are not a lot of countries around the world have refineries that are set up for heavy oil that comes out of the tar sands. California and the US Gulf Coast are where 90% of those refineries are. So that's the real reason Canadian oil goes to the US market, is because those are the people that can refine it. So most of the oil from Trans Mountain that is shipped goes to these refineries. We've seen the last year or so, due to COVID and some changing incentives in the United States, a lot of refineries in California either closing or switching to renewable fuel sources, like agricultural waste and soy. Now there are some pretty bad environmental impacts from those kind of fuel sources as well. So I'm not endorsing that, but I would say that it should be alarming for the federal government and other people trying to turn Trans Mountain into a real business, that even the Californian refineries are moving away from this kind of oil.
Thank you.
There's a question from the
yeah, I saw that, Rolly. I was just going to ask one follow-up and then ask that from Angela. Okay. Just to Sven, on the insurers, the strategy of using it as a pinch point or a pressure point to have insurers back off, stop insuring the Trans Mountain. Is there a tipping point on that? How many insurers do you have to get out, do you think, to have them just not be able to do it? Or will other insurers just come flowing in? Or what has happened with Zurich stepping back and the other one you mentioned?
So, I mean, so far the company tells us they've been able to replace all the insurers that walked away from the project. I mean, when we get companies like Zurich to drop Trans Mountain, they drop not just this pipeline, but all oil sands projects. And we usually try to get these companies to adopt policies that they won't insure a whole list of projects that are bad for climate change. And insurers, because they are on the hook already for billions of dollars in claims from more intense extreme weather events and other climate impacts, they are more awake to this problem than some other parts of the financial sector. So this is, I think, you know, it's going to be difficult for us to completely deny Trans Mountain access to insurance, but we are reforming the insurance industry as a whole through this work. And I think that has real value in the long run.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. With the pride around Trans Mountain and Trudeau not wanting to cancel it, I was wondering what either of yours analysis was of the departure of Bill Morneau and the replacement with Chrystia Freeland, and whether it seemed that the timing of that and the way it happened, and with the Carney around from the the banker in Ottawa at the time. I'm just wondering if you guys, either of you, have an analysis of that that would be helpful.
I can start us off. I think, Bill Morneau invested a lot of his own personal capital in the Trans Mountain buyout. So there certainly, I think he would have been a strong backer of the project. And, his departure, there was some hope that might signal, some different political directions, or, it's hard for someone who's really invested, in that way to make the call. And then with Christy Freeland coming in fresh, with a different perspective, who could kind of look afresh at the lack of viability. And she's in charge of Canada's financial health. She should be able to see when the math doesn't add up. Mark Carney, great influencer. If he were to come into some of the roles we've heard that he could potentially occupy in the future, he's the one who has said that half the world's oil project could become stranded assets. So he would certainly provide a great voice that we would love to hear more of. Christy Freeland, however,
he's not a card-carrying member of Dogwood yet, or Stand.Earth.
Not that I can say, no. We'd love to have him on the team.
Go ahead, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I mean, Christy Freeland is also, she, has been tasked with building relationships with Alberta. So I don't think her appointment and her position within cabinet is necessarily signaling a change in direction on that front, because we know that her links there are strong. She has been trying to build bridges with Alberta for some time. So I'm not sure her appointment or her position there is necessarily giving us lots of positive signals there.
Thank you. I've got another question, a little different. In the US, they're constantly talking now about the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And I was wondering if Dogwood or Stand.Earth had located a progressive wing of the Liberal Party. Because obviously the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is what's pushed Biden to do a lot of the climate stuff he's doing. I think that's a no-brainer, Sunrise Movement, etc. But I'm wondering, in Canada, is there such a thing as a progressive wing of the Liberal Party? I certainly never hear about it.
Well, I mean, I would say there's certainly a climate conscious wing of the Liberal Party. I don't know if I would describe them as across the board progressive the same way I might AOC or some of the other emerging leaders in the Democratic Party. But if you look at Stephen Guilbeault, for instance, the Heritage Minister, came from Équiterre, and a leading environmental group in Quebec, has been outspoken on issues including the Trans Mountain Pipeline, where he disagrees with his government. Certainly during the years that Stéphane Dion ran the party, they were ahead of their time somewhat on climate issues. But there is a real struggle in the party between people that are more concerned about what Bay Street and the big 5 Canadian banks want, and kind of the more emerging concern around climate and the environment. So it does exist. It's not maybe as well defined as the split in the Democratic Party in the United States, because that is a broader tent party.
Thank you.
I think Nathaniel Erskine Smith is supposed to be good. There's one.
Okay, I've got a
Can we
question.
go to audience questions?
Yeah, I've got a question here from Angela Bishkoff. If we were to shut down all these pipelines, what would the transition look like, and what would replace oil and gas? Easy question. Thanks, Angela.
No problem. Alexandra, did you want to take the first shot at this?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have seen a lot of evidence showing that, per dollar invested, renewable energy creates more jobs and is a, a long-term greater moneymaker. So that would be my first real answer to that question, is that, we're talking about a managed transition. We're not talking about everything overnight in the next 24 hours, anything like that. But I think it's really clear. And this honestly was a hard sell for us as environmentalists and as climate campaigners. Even 5 years ago, it was really hard to have this conversation and to talk about what a different kind of economy and a renewable energy economy could look like. And that is, we're in such a different environment, a different world now, where solar is now, officially the cheapest way to produce energy on the planet, where, the cost and the ROI on renewables just keeps going up, and the reverse is true for fossil fuels. So I think we're in a different world where global governments get that, our government gets that. We are on that path, and it's a question of how quickly we follow that path, and that ultimately is a question of survivability and justice around who's going to suffer from the impacts of climate change. So I think it's clear that Canada is really well positioned. Alberta is really well positioned to make that transition, to offer and be a leader and gets have an economic advantage by pursuing renewables and clean tech and green technologies, if we're willing and we find the political will and capital to make that happen. I think the evidence is pretty clear on that now in a way that it just wasn't 5 years ago. So it's about political will, I would say, rather than kind of engineering realities for going through this transition.
Thank you.
So I would say, the first step that we should be clear about is what we're talking about is no longer growing the fossil fuel economy. When you build a project like a pipeline, it's not about where we're going to get gas to put in our tank tomorrow or next week. It's about what kind of energy we're going to be using in 30 years, because it takes 30 years to pay off these projects once they've been built. And we're kind of locked into fossil fuels if we allow this new infrastructure to continue to be built. And then from there, I would say that, oil is going to be with us in some form for quite a while, right? Like, we stopped using trains as the primary way of getting around the country in the 1940s and 50s, but trains still exist and they're still an important part of our economy. Fossil fuels will be with us. We're going to need them for things like petrochemicals and fertilizer, for plastics and pharmaceuticals. All those things are going to be with us for a while, even after we stop burning oil. We've set the goal of being net zero climate emissions by 2050. Most governments around the world are adopting those kind of targets. That means we need to stop burning fossil fuels on that timeline. We're going to continue to have some forms of fossil fuels in our lives, but they're no longer going to be the dominant source of energy over the next 30 years.
Sven, you wrote, related to that, you wrote in the National Observer last year, time to bail out Alberta workers, not billionaires and oil company CEOs, back in April of 2020. I was wondering if the federal government had taken you up on that yet.
Not yet. No. I think this is the real frustrating part. We did a study last year that looked into who owns the oil sands. It's still over 70% owned by foreign investors. So when we give subsidies and bailouts to these companies, we're basically sending our money, our taxpayers' money, offshore to investors and owners from around the world. Instead of investing that money in helping workers retrain, take the skills they have and apply them to new industries. We've seen, little stories about this popping up, like rig workers who have gone from drilling for oil to building geothermal, renewable power stations. The people who do welding and boiler making, all that can be used to build windmills and solar installations. And there's a great group called Iron and Earth that is led by tar sands workers who are looking for those kind of opportunities to transition into new economy jobs. They have had, though, a really frustrating hard time getting the federal government and other levels of government to step up and fund that retraining work, even though they're willing to, they've got people signed up to take the training, they're ready to do the hard work, create the programs. They've got partners in the renewable sector that want to start hiring these workers. We just need a little bit of public money to make that possible. And every time we subsidize oil, instead of investing in our own workers and citizens, we rob ourselves of future opportunities.
Maureen Buchanan has asked a related question in the Q&A. What are the links that are being built with Alberta labor movement to support their leadership in the sell of the transition to the Alberta government and people? Alexandra, do you want to take a shot at that?
I am not super familiar with links with Alberta Labor. I mean, I think broadly speaking, it's so clear that the people who are most at risk and who are being most hurt by these bad decisions is like the, Alberta economy, broadly speaking, everyday Albertans, oil and gas workers who are essentially being tied into this declining economy by a political, ideology of their government. If they're the ones who are going to really, everyday Albertans and oil workers in particular are the ones who are being cheated, as Sven said, out of good jobs, local jobs, healthy future jobs, and are going to suffer from it. And same with services across the province, because they've hitched their wagons so closely to this industry. In terms of links, yeah, I can't really speak to the kind of labor side. I don't know if Sven, you've got any insights there.
I mean, I think it's fair to say that as a movement, environmentalists need to do more to reach out to organized labor, especially in Alberta. I mean, I will say that in the opportunities I've had to sit down with, say, uniform members that represent refinery workers and some other key labor folks, the people who work in these plants are well aware that a transition has to happen. They understand the economics of their industry better than we do sometimes. And they know that they need to make transitions and changes. Also point out that, most of the long-term good paying jobs in oil and gas are in the refining part of the pipeline. And all of the pipelines that we've been fighting about for the last decade or more here in Canada are about exporting raw resources out of the country without doing any of that value-added work. So the agenda around pipelines has been more about making profit for the international oil companies than it has been putting Canadians to work. And I think that has gotten lost often in the debate around pipelines.
Could I just mention that we're going to be discussing green jobs and a just transition on February 17th. So we'll be looking more into this.
So perhaps this would be a good reminder for there is one question about what will happen once alternative energy supply is in place in terms of long-term jobs in alternative energies. I don't know if that should be addressed now, or we can talk about it, as you said, Kathleen, at the green jobs session.
Well, we've looked into it quite a bit. Is there anything else that we'd like to, Angela, would you like to repeat your actions and just give another plug?
Sure. I think we've talked a lot about, the case for, anyway, I'll pop them in the chat and I'll leave it there. I don't need to plug my actions any further than I already have, but I will make sure that the links are there for you again in the chat.
Okay, thank you, Alexandra.
In the chat, there was a question about, so where will the jobs be once we transition to the renewables? Either of you want to address that?
Well, I mean, I think first, I don't want to undersell how many jobs will be created by the transition, because we're not just talking about installing a couple solar panels. We have to change a whole lot about how our society works. And so, for instance, I think there are a lot more jobs actually going to be created in retrofitting buildings. Basically, every public institution, every home, every business is going to need an energy retrofit over the next couple of decades. And that is going to create an enormous amount of work. But I think the longer term question around, like, where are the jobs going to create? I mean, we tend to really narrowly focus the discussion about jobs around the goods economy, right? The manufacturing, creating products, that actually only makes up about 20% of the jobs in the Canadian economy. The other 80% are in the service industry. So that's everything from retail to high tech, right? And it crosses all that kind of spectrum of it as well. So that is already where the Canadian economy is, and that is only going to continue to grow. I think there is an interesting moment right now because COVID has really, I think, hurt the service side of the economy much more than the goods side. Our instinct as employer or as a government is usually to invest in infrastructure projects in that kind of infrastructure and construction side. And the people who are really hurting are actually in that much larger section of the economy. So how we come back from COVID and where we invest stimulus funds is a really big question. And it's not just in terms of, are we going to use the money to build renewables or pipelines? It's also like, are we going to support the goods economy and continue to prop them up? Or are we going to start investing in the other part where most Canadians work?
I think that's a very important point, Sven. Thank you. And the problem is we just don't have those discussions about competing priorities. What is most important? These things just get announced out of the blue. We're buying a pipeline, and we really need to, if we're serious about our carbon commitments for Paris, we need to have a discussion about where are we going to have, what percentage of the carbon is going to go to who, which industries. And of course, the oil and gas industry is still expanding their carbon footprint while everyone else is trying desperately to reduce it. And it's quite clear that we will never meet our targets without the oil and gas industry. Barry Saxifrage has done a very nice recent article in the National Observer pointing out just how almost impossible it will be to meet our 2030 targets as long as the oil and gas industry is a huge outlier, still expanding its carbon footprint. Want to talk to you either Alexandra?
No, it just reminds me of a very similar analysis done in BC that, essentially every single other sector of the economy, every single thing each of us does every day, and the rest of the economy would have to go to zero if we don't deal with the oil and gas sector. So I think it's a really excellent point, and it's particularly when we consider, as Sven pointed out, who's benefiting, who is making the money here, who we are essentially arguing over padding the profits of foreign companies to squeeze a few last drops out rather than, making the lead now that we know we need to make. And that's certainly for me, when we come back to Trans Mountain, the thing that blows my mind is that Trudeau's main argument for it is that we need to do this project so that we can earn money, so that we can invest in green energy, so that we can plant trees. But here's at least 12.6 billion, 10 billion now, just sitting in a pot, ready to put those dollars to work right here, right now, on the ground in COVID, even in terms of stimulus dollars and putting folks to work. So I think there's just a huge number of talking points that have become entrenched in the Canadian conversation when it comes to oil and gas, when it comes to Trans Mountain, that really bear very little basis in reality. And it's just so needed to have these conversations so that we can really dig behind those headlines where we know folks like CAP, like the oil industry, have controlled the conversation too much, and whose talking points have become accepted fact when it's just no longer the case.
Thank you. I would be remiss to not mention, because it comes up when I discuss pipelines with people, but it's more dangerous to move oil on trains. And I just want to hear what you have to say about that.
Sure. I mean, I would say both of them are really bad ideas. So increasing the amount of oil by rail is risky. It tends, it works out to you spill slightly more oil through pipelines. Of course, you have, really dangerous accidents that can happen right in communities or bodies of water with rail. You also get, pipeline leaks. The existing Trans Mountain pipeline, it's been around for about 60 years. It's had 80 serious leaks. So both are really dangerous, and we shouldn't be expanding either of them, especially in communities.
I think the other thing is it's hard enough to fight them to not build them, like to have compelling arguments not to build them. But once they've built them, it's just an order of magnitude more difficult to imagine trying to convince people to stop using something that isn't paid. Like the federal government's got all this money, it's not even paid for. Okay, it's a couple minutes after 2 now. Kathleen?
I was just going to say, maybe we should move on and talk about next week's Zoom, because Donald Goodstein is an absolutely fabulous researcher, and He's exposed so much about what the difference, when we were talking about, Sven, when you mentioned Trudeau the being haunted by his father, it really does seem to be that the world has changed a lot since Trudeau the elder, and Donald Goodstein more or less documents the changes over since Trudeau the father until now, in terms of what government can do and what government isn't doing now. So it should be a very good talk.
Alexandra or Sven, have either of you had interaction with Donald Goodstein? No.
Well, he talks about neoliberalism, and that's the main difference between Pierre Trudeau and Justin Trudeau. Pierre Trudeau was governing in the time before neoliberalism, when government was expected to do things and do good things and build the country and help the people. I mean, to a certain extent, he wasn't a god, but over the last few decades, government has been minimized and corporations have been expanded in their power, as we all know, with globalization and deregulation and privatization. So it will be and meanwhile, over those decades of the building of neoliberalism, we've seen the building of the climate crisis. So he talks about how one has affected the other. And it's quite eye-opening, really.
Yeah, I think he's done a tremendous amount of great background work that really helps people understand what is going on, why these decisions keep being the really wrong decisions because of all the think tanks, and how embedded the oil and gas industry has gotten into the Alberta government, the Alberta universities, the federal government, other universities in Canada, in setting the narrative, the agenda, so that we're not having the discussions of how do we want to use our carbon. And also, he also argues that Canada, the Trudeau government's choice to put so much emphasis and put so much political capital into the climate taxes, carbon taxes is exactly what the oil and gas industry wanted the Liberal government to do. So they use up their political capital and keep the focus on these carbon taxes instead of on should we be building more pipelines and oil and gas infrastructure. Anyway, I think it's going to be a fascinating session. So I think I don't see any more questions. Rolly, see any more questions from the audience?
No, I think we've covered everything, and no, we're fine. And I think we're getting some nice commentary from some of the participants about the quality of the speakers today, and very informative.
Alexandra, did you want to just say any last closing statement? Sell your case, finish up the story, and just any last point you'd like to make?
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I really appreciate everyone's time. And I think it's so important, particularly Trans Mountain is a really big focus for Dogwood. We're a BC-based organization, and Trans Mountain often gets kind of siloed or pigeonholed as a BC fight, but we absolutely know that it's a Canadian fight. It's about all of our tax dollars. This is an issue that every single Canadian, regardless of your stand on climate, even on oil and gas or on pipelines, it matters to you because of the use of your tax dollars and the risk and the waste there. But the point really I was making there is I really appreciate the opportunity to reach out and have this conversation to an audience, not just in BC, in Ottawa and Ontario and Quebec and wherever folks are calling in from today. And I would really just encourage folks to bring these conversations back into your communities, back to your kitchen tables. We at Dogwood, we believe in community organizing. We think that a kitchen table conversation, that's how these things grow. That's how change happens. It starts small, and when we organize in our communities, anything's possible. So appreciate the time today, and thank you so much to Ken and Kathleen and everyone for being part of this conversation today.
Alexander, thank you. I just wonder if you wanted to pitch Dogwood anymore. I don't know. I have no idea how many of the audience members know Dogwood. It's definitely very local to BC, but they seem to extract money from me monthly.
Me too.
Well, thank you so much to you both. We couldn't do it without you. Dogwood, yeah, we are BC's kind of largest citizen action network. We've got about 250,000 supporters who care about the environment, you know, we have worked on pipelines and tankers for a very long time. That's kind of what we're most known for, but we are also really our kind of core principle is that the people who live here are the ones who should be making decisions about what happened here. And it's about taking power back from companies and elites and big government and putting power in the hands of local people. So we've done a lot of work around kind of democratic reform and these kind of things as well. And, you know, as I mentioned, our kind of foundation principle is around organizing. It's the fact that, you know, if small groups of people can organize their neighbors and their friends, and if we can kind of move out from that kitchen table to the wider sphere, that's how we build power. And, you know, we've had some big wins over time, and here we are now in the middle of new battles. So yeah, check it out, dogwoodbc.ca, and feel free to hop on. We talk a lot about pipelines, but we talk a lot about other stuff too. So check out our website and join our list. And we send you very carefully curated emails. So if you're not in BC, you won't get the BC stuff only. You'll get stuff relevant to where you live as well.
Thank you, Alexandra. Sven, would you like to say any closing words and maybe a pitch for Stand.Earth? I know they do fabulous work. I just saw last week on the CanRac seminar, Sapporo laid out some very interesting stuff.
I just want to thank everybody for coming out today and thank the organizers for putting together this series. It's very informative. Stand, we got started here on the West Coast, kind of connecting folks in the US and Canada who are facing similar problems across the border. So we work mostly up and down the West Coast of North and now a little bit into South America, fighting projects all the way from Alaska to the Amazon. And we're kind of like just looking for the gaps where we can find a little bit of leverage to move decision makers, whether they're on the corporate side or the government side. So we do everything from, we're still fighting to protect the Great Bear Rainforest on BC's north coast and reduce old growth logging here in British Columbia. We're also working with to reduce the climate emissions from industries like fashion and the shipping sector, and doing some interesting work to stop oil extraction and logging in the headwaters of the Amazon in Peru and Ecuador. So we are kind of all up and down this side of the country or continent, and looking for opportunities to kind of build this thin green line that protects our continent and our world on this part of Turtle Island.
Well, thank you, both of you. It's been very informative for me. I hope the participants, the attendees have enjoyed it as well. Some very insightful on the ground perspectives on a lot of things that we know, everyone knows some about, but not as intimately as you folks. And we appreciate very much the two of you coming on, and we thank all the attendees as well for being with us. Kathleen, any last word for you?
I just wondered if you have that slide with Trudeau, Freeland, O'Regan, and Wilkinson's.
Yeah, I can put that up.
We've got the Hill phone numbers, the constituency phone numbers, the emails, and the more they hear from us, the better. No, not that one. There. By the way, anyone wanting to write to an MP, even the top MP, the Prime Minister, all you have to do is know their name. You put the first name dot last name at parl, P-A-R-L, .gc.ca, and send them. I send them articles and everything I can, just to show them that I'm out there and other people are out there. So bother them. They get well paid to be bothered, and that's what they signed up for. And they're not doing a good enough job, so we have to straighten them out, and the sooner the better. So I thank you all as well, and I guess we'll be signing off. We'll leave this up for a few minutes.
I just recommend that, fortunately, I don't think you can click on the links, but if you took a screenshot of it, you'd at least have the key information. Okay, great. Thanks again, Alexandra. Thanks, Sven. And we'll be back next week.